Religious beliefs are intertwined with the cultures of most peoples, and whether practiced in a church, temple, synagogue, mosque, or under the trees, religion provided man with closer understanding of the purpose of life. Religion does more. It allows man to formulate his own interpretation of death and the possible realm that lies beyond the grave.
I am Chief George Ramokopa, Chief number 4 of this tribe. I'm now standing in my cattle kraal, where, according to our tradition, my great-grandfather, Pete Mamafa Ramokopa, and his son, Tabudi Simon Ramokopa, and my son are buried in this kraal.
It is difficult to generalize about burial in a tribal society because practices differ. It was always the tradition for chiefs to be buried in the cattle fold or near its hedge or beneath it. And in some cases, they were buried in sacred caves. Less important people were buried in the floor of the hut or nearby the hut, or in a sacred grove or some communal graveyard. Graves are dug deep and wide, and it is not uncommon for the corpse to be placed in a sitting position in a cavity dug out of the wall of the grave, and for personal belongings to be buried with the corpse. And when the grave has been filled and smoothed, it is shaped into the form either of a mound, or in some cases it is packed with stones to form a cairn. And items placed on top of the grave are also personal belongings of the deceased, such as a beer pot or a headrest, and I've even seen a riding whip. And in the case of children, these would be toys.
In the changing fabric of the tribal society, attitudes towards burial have also altered to some extent. This is Sibasa in Venderland, where an urban burial society pays a visit to the kraal of headman Marubini Tsuvasi. The headman explains that the Venda are scrupulous about the way they bury their dead, and that he can see advantages for his people in joining the burial society. Many urban dwellers still have relatives in tribal areas, also cattle and other possessions. Hence the need to goduka, which means to go back home. Birth and death. Phenomena which have always prodded the thoughtful man, firing his imagination and challenging his understanding. Nature abounds with manifestations of the giving and taking of life, the endless spectrum of birth and death.
Behind it all, tribal man acknowledges the existence of a supreme being, a creator whose workings are so great and abode so remote as to defy the comprehension of mortals. Known as Nkulunkulu, Kamata, Kulunga, Raluvimba, or Mudimu in various languages, there are no rituals directed to this supreme being. Yet who can doubt its existence? Who else could have created the universe and all its physical and intangible wonders? Who else could have made its presence known with examples of such awesome power?
In context with these marvels and mysteries of life itself, how does tribal man view death? What is his concept of the ultimate termination of earthly life?
Southern African tribes accept unreservedly the concept of life after death. Also, the link between the body and the soul, referring to the soul as the breath or shadow, and in some parts, a combination of both. Opinions about the destination of the soul after death are not altogether clear. It would seem, however, to be somewhere underground or somewhere above, in some cases in some sacred forest or river, or near a waterfall or sacred lake. But one thing comes out very clearly, and that is that the realm of the ancestors barely differs from life on earth, except that it's inclined to be more prosperous. The ancestors can make their presence known in a number of ways, the most common of which I would say is by way of dreams. So therefore, dreaming about an ancestor can be a most uplifting experience, or on the other hand, a most depressing one, depending upon the impression left on the mind. And should this impression be one of doubt or insecurity, and especially of fear, then it would need making contact with a diviner for interpretation and clarification. Ancestors make their presence known in other ways. For example, the sudden appearance of a lion, or leopard, or ant bear, or some similar creature, or even a snake. And this accounts for the fact that one very often finds non-poisonous species of snakes tucked away in the rafters of huts, unmolested, and in fact made to feel welcome by the occupants. So no matter which way the ancestors reveal themselves, they have a profound effect on spiritual life. All tribes have a special place dedicated to the ancestors. And this may be a section of a hut as among the Basotho, or it could be part of the cattle fold as among the Zulu, the Xhosa, and the Swazi. Now the Venda have many shrines, the simplest of which is no larger than a tiny stone which has been planted in the courtyard among the huts.
The weapons are all heirlooms which have been inherited by this village from successive generations of ancestral headmen. It is said that some of the assegais are at least 2 centuries old.
The more elaborate Venda shrines, which belong to chiefs and headmen, well, these consist of a cylindrical stone, which is known as makulu, and represents the ancestral grandfather. And beside that, a similar stone, only smaller, which represents the ancestral grandmother. Now, these shrines are usually packed with heirlooms, such as beads and horns and axes and weapons, all of which were used by the ancestors before their departure to the realm of spirits.
Carvings man the gateway to the sanctum of Mojaji IV, legendary reign queen of the Lobedu tribe of the northeastern Transvaal, and within her village, one of many cylindrical shrines.
In the Leboa, one doesn't find shrines such as this one in all settlements. But here in Muletsi, which is north of Pietersburg, one finds shrines everywhere. Virtually every household has one like this one. Now, this morning when I discovered this shrine, I found its symbolism extremely interesting. So I asked the owner of this home to explain this symbolism to me. Well, he said, this red flower's name is Kwenapoko. And this didn't make sense because Kwenapoko is a name of a person. And so by delving a little bit further, he said it was Mukhalabe. This means an old man. Then he said it was Lekwaba, and one could understand what this was. This symbolized the grandfather who is now an ancestor. And so, speaking further, we came to this one. And he said this was Tuntwane, which means the old lady. It represented the female lineage of this particular place. But what is also interesting about this type of shrine is that not any plant can be used. It has to be this kind or that kind. That is the Lekwaba or the Tuntwane. Most interesting, too, is the fact that one finds them growing in all parts of southern Africa. Here is another shrine. The difference is that medicines have been very carefully placed around the male ancestor and the female ancestor. I came across this ceremony in the village of Chief Moloto near Petersburg, where I was invited to take part in the proceedings. The spring rains had fallen and the new season's crops were about to be planted, so the villagers were making contact with their ancestors in order to solicit their blessing. The presiding headman explained that just prior to my arrival, a goat had been slaughtered and offered to the ancestral grandfather of this group of worshippers. As is the custom, all the worshippers took turns in making personal offerings of beer.
Offerings to the ancestors take many forms. In Venderland, chiefs and other important lineages possess sacred bulls called Makulu, that is, grandfather. Sacred bulls are said to embody the spirit of ancestral patriarchs. In this village, the chief makes an offering to his particular ancestor by pouring beer over the back of a sacred bull. In Venderland, the sacred bull features prominently in rituals performed after the crops have been reaped. The special animal is ceremoniously fed on portions of the harvest as a token of thanksgiving for harvested crops.
There are many places in Venderland said to be inhabited by the spirits, like the forests and hills where chiefs are buried, secluded valleys and rivers, and spirits are said to abound in the region of the Pipidi Falls, where the most mysterious sounds and echoes can be heard. The drumming of invisible drums, the sighing, whimpering, and lamentations of people, and the echo of voices. Yes, there are many places where spirits are said to abide, but none as important as the shores and the waters of Lake Fundutsi. Many thousands of Venda have never seen Lake Fundutsi, but they all seem to know about it. And they know it as a place where the most uncanny experiences take place. They also know it as a place where ancient rituals, virtually untouched by time, are performed, and where the priest in charge is about 100 years old. Now, I've met the old priest, and I can't vouch for his age, but in discussing historical events with him, I would say he must be roughly 100 years old. I found him to be a wonderful old man, and this makes me sad when I think of his passing away roughly 4 months after my last visit to him.
The procession to the lake begins. The girls dressed in the leaves of the crops, and the men carrying a parcel of spears, assegais, and other objects once used by the ancestors of the lineage. The old priest approaches the lake, and the ancient ceremony begins. First, the spirits must be evoked by throwing stones into the water. Should the spirits be angry or non-cooperative, the stones will be thrown back or washed up on the shore. And now, the actual offering. Beer is poured into the water. Should it sink quickly, it's a sign that the spirits are satisfied and have accepted the offering. But if it lingers on the surface, it means that the spirits have refused to accept the offering and are therefore not likely to cooperate. This part of the lake is holy ground and may only be visited with the permission of the custodian, Chief Nchiavu. Here, the wearing of shoes is forbidden and swimming and fishing are strictly prohibited.
On another occasion, also near the shores of Lake Fundutsi, we were privileged to witness part of this ceremony, an offering of thanksgiving to the ancestors for an abundant harvest. An offering of beer is made to them on a very special stone. The spot is used year after year by the chief and his subjects.
Shrouded in legend and mystery, Lake Fundutsi has an aura all of its own and is symbolic of the profound importance attached to the spirit world throughout the fabric of the tribal society. And spiritual significance comes in many forms.
The Venda, like other tribes in the more northerly reaches of southern Africa, use a fire such as this one in ritual. This is, in fact, a sacred fire. Now, obviously it is very cold tonight. This is midwinter, and the people who are dancing around this are receiving the heat from this fire to warm their bodies. But it means far more than that. It means that they are drawing spiritual warmth, all experiencing the same sensation. The sacred fire, this great fire, is lit by the local practitioner, whom we call a medicine man. A few years ago, when I was researching in Abombaland, I found that the chiefs up there each had a sacred fire in a little palisade enclosure. And that fire was lit when they became chiefs, and it had to be kept alight night and day in and day out, week in, week out, throughout their lives, and could only die when the chief himself died. And one day, in one of the crawls, the chief called us all together because one of his cronies was about to go on a long journey. And so he asked us to extend our hands over the fire. And then he said a short prayer. And as we all felt the same sensation of heat, spiritual heat, he asked that his friend should be conducted along that lengthy road to safety. In this series, we've shared some of the highlights of tribal culture in southern Africa, from cradle to grave. The observances surrounding the birth of a child, the carefree years of infancy, the many activities of childhood, the initiation of adolescent boys and girls in preparation for betrothal, marriage, and parenthood. In fact, we have seen a wide spectrum of life, one tinctured with time-tested codes and disciplines and aspirations in which everyone, young and old, has a well-defined role to play.
Roles embracing the gathering of food from nature's vast and abundant storehouse, and roles embracing the provision of homes and dwellings, roles connected with the production of clothing, utensils, implements, and items of ornamentation. Roles that are defined and distinct from early childhood and right across the spectrum of society into old age. Everybody has a function, a meaningful place, and contributes towards the general requirements of the community.
Nature has contributed significantly to the tribal identity because in the course of many centuries, tribal communities have relied on the environment and climatic conditions for food, medicines, and other supplies. Probably from out of the awareness that nature was beyond the control of mortal man came the formulation of tribal spiritual attitudes, the concept of the supreme being, and a belief in the realm of ancestors. Hence, the many rituals observed, and the ceremonies performed, and the elevated status enjoyed by diviners and medicine men.
Often strange, mysterious, and sometimes incomprehensible. But the magic and medicine of southern Africa's tribal society had their beginnings in the distant centuries of Africa's past, and, due to their proven qualities, have remained a part of the tribal identity.
The tribal identity can be seen as a heritage which struck root in ancient times and then sprouted and blossomed into a many-faceted indigenous culture.
And what a culture! An all-embracing one, pragmatic and largely self-reliant. Despite the passing of time and the influence of Western ideas, the essence of the tribal identity has survived, mainly as a result of tribal man's inherent affinity with his long and enduring heritage.
A heritage which was destined to undergo change, gradually at first, and then rapidly as tribal families moved to towns and cities and spontaneously adapted to new and exotic cultural experiences in the course of urbanization.
The changing face of Africa, a kaleidoscope of people, places, and activities, constantly adapting from the past to the present and from the present to the future. But this is so with peoples everywhere, for time is infinite. Here we have briefly focused our attention on Southern African tribal society, and have been privileged to do so with the guidance of a man who has made this study a dedication. How then does Peter Becker regard his future role in context with the tribal identity?
Over the years, I've had the privilege of witnessing and recording in writing, on tape, and photographically the changing face of the tribal identity, including features which have now disappeared. The challenge before me, as I see it, is to keep assiduously abreast of developments. For as sure as the sun will continue each day to rise and set, so will the tribal identity continue to undergo change.